Now, Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nisi.
From the Rhode Island State House to the halls of Congress to the capitals of Europe, governments are tightening their belts under a policy known as austerity. Brown University professor Mark Blyth thinks they're making a fatal mistake.
Austerity. It's big in Europe. It's getting big here. Everyone in the Prime Minister has been talking about it. But what is it?
Blyth's video critique of austerity went viral, and now he's turned it into a full-length book. His argument, leaders may doom their economies to years of stagnation by cutting spending and raising taxes too much, too soon. This week on Executive Suite, Brown University professor of international political economy, Mark Blyth. Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi. Mark, professor, thanks for being here today.
Nice to be here,
I
Ted.
appreciate it. You know, you're right here in our backyard at Brown University, but I actually first heard about your book when you were mentioned in a Financial Times opinion piece a few months back. Oh. And so I thought, I got to get this fellow on the show. He can get here pretty easily. And the book is here. You can see the cover, Austerity, the History of a Dangerous Idea. It's just out recently here from the publisher, and it's getting good reviews, so congrats on that.
Thank you.
Let's start with the simplest question of all. What is austerity?
Austerity is the belief that, a quite rational belief and quite normal belief that if you spent too much, a good idea is to stop spending. And that's true, but there's a fatal flaw, there's several fatal flaws in the argument. First of all, that applies to families. So if families spend too much, stop spending. Governments aren't families. Families don't get to issue their own currency. Families don't get to import members into the family and tax them across generations to pay debt that they issue, all this sort of stuff. So there's a kind of difference immediately there. But it still makes a lot of sense to cut back government spending if that's been the problem. But there's another flaw. Why have we got all this debt? There's been a $7 trillion increase in US debt since 2007, 2008. What happened in 2008? Financial crisis. We bailed the financial system. And we protected the assets of people who have been basically making off of most of the gains for the past 30 years. And the consequence of that is now we have to cut government spending, which is spent on people who didn't make most of those gains. So there's a kind of a politics in there which is not very nice. And this is what you see being played out in the streets of Europe just now. But the third one and most important one, and this was the real surprise when I did the book, is that when you cut government debt in a recession at the same time as every other government is doing it, you simply make the debt bigger. That's the real surprise.
A lot of this goes right back to John Maynard Keynes in 1936, the basics of what we've learned about economies since then. But do you think a lot of it's been forgotten, or do you think people are actively ignoring the lessons of the past? Sometimes
it's ideology, sometimes it's self-interest, sometimes it's ignorance. I mean, they're all in the mix at the one time. But it's not that this is a uniquely Keynesian idea by any means. A very simple, commonsensical way of thinking about it is the following. So let's say you've got a government that's got 80% of its economy is government debt. So you've got a debt to GDP ratio of 80%, common for a European country. You think, wow, that's a lot of debt. So imagine that as a fraction, 4/5. Now, here's why the problem starts. Imagine the government says, you're right, we're spending too much. We're going to cut half of government expenditure. So let's say that 5, right, the size of the economy, goes down by 50% in terms of the government share, which is 40% of GDP. That 5 becomes a 4. Your fraction is now 4/4. You've got 100% debt to GDP because you cut government spending. Now, when any one government or firm or even a family cuts their debt, so long as everybody else is spending, you still have income from which you can save. But what happens if everybody does this at the same time? It's called the fallacy of composition. What's true about any one of the parts isn't true about all of the parts if they do it sequentially at the same time. That's the danger. So in the abstract, on its own, it's no problem. Of course you should have less debt. But if you all try and simultaneously cut and save at the same point in time, you create what Keynes called, and it's not his idea, the paradox of thrift, that in trying to save, you actually create more debt and more indebtedness.
It's a vicious cycle then.
Exactly.
You go around and around, and that's
look at Europe. Look at where Europe is now. That's exactly it. Every European state that began an austerity program in 2009 now has more debt than when it started, even when you control for the debt that was created bailing out the financial sector. So you end up with, the point of the whole thing is to create less debt. You're creating more debt. By definition, it doesn't work.
Now, in the book, one of the things you talk about a lot is looking back at history. I mentioned Keynes. He was writing in the 1930s as the Depression hit all over the world, and then World War II came upon us. You write in the book, austerity didn't just fail, it helped blow up the world. That's the very definition of a dangerous idea. What do you mean by that? It helped blow up the world in the 30s?
My two most surprising case studies on this were what happened in France and what happened in Germany in the 1930s. So the standard argument you get from the Germans as well was the inflation, and we all had wheelbarrows filled with money, and this is why Hitler came around.
Yeah, the Weimar Republic,
Right,
all
well,
that.
the timing's off. I mean, the Great Inflation was deliberate government policy by the Germans to stick it to the French over reparations in 1923 when they invaded the Ruhr. The inflation was over by 1924. Between 24 and 28, Germany was the most stable and growing economy in Europe. What happened in 1928, 29, all the money that was short-term American money that was basically given loans to Germany, they were going to be the new economy again, flips back out because of the Wall Street bubble and various other factors. There's a giant sort of sucking sound as all the money leaves. At that point in time, they raise interest rates and they cut spending. They do this. They do austerity. At that point in time, there's a minor party that everyone's forgotten about called the Nazis. They went from 18% of the vote to 43% of the vote in 3 years. And it was directly because of austerity. And it was because of the cuts. Even more spectacular example, Japan had been trying to get back on what was called the gold standard during the 1920s to stabilize its currency and to get back involved with international trade. It makes tremendous austerity sacrifices, 50% of public expenditure cut over a 10-year period. Guess who's bearing the brunt of that in Japanese society? It's the Japanese military. So eventually, after 10 years of cuts, the Japanese military say, enough, they start assassinating their financial elite. They kill off the banking class. They start going after bank directors, finance ministers, 2 prime ministers, 2 finance ministers, and a host of other politicians. It racks up quite a body count. Eventually, what happens is the military takes over, because this is how they can get control of the budget. So this can have very, very serious consequences. And we seem to have forgotten those lessons.
One of the biggest criticisms you hear from those who promote austerity is that folks writing like you, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, who oppose austerity, would just spend forever and ever and ever, that there are no limits. What if the economy doesn't bounce back? Then you'll need more debt, and you're in this terrible, a different vicious cycle where the debt just piles up and you never actually get to an economy. What do you say to folks like that? As you said, it has a basic appeal, the idea that we do need to tighten our belts.
Well, let's take that phrase, we need to tighten our belts. Well, who's we? I mean, I'm in favour of everyone tightening their belts the minute we're all wearing the same pants. But we're not wearing the same pants, and we're less wearing the same pants as a society than we've been since the 1920s. So the people who are being asked to tighten are the ones that can least afford it, and that produces a very noxious politics. This is what we're seeing in Italy just now, and in Greece and other places. But, you know, let's take the point seriously. You can't just keep spending. I absolutely agree. You know what Keynes said about this? To go back to Keynes, and again, it's not his idea. You know when the best time to reduce debt? When you're in a boom. You know what reduces debt more than anything else? Growth. And the simple way to start growth is stop cutting. Just stop doing it. If you don't believe in government intervention, I'm with you. Let's not intervene, because cutting is also an intervention. Just as spending is, it's just the other side of the budget. So when you intervene to cut, you're acting in the economy in such a way that you're reducing opportunity, you're reducing growth, you're reducing tax revenue, you're actually paradoxically increasing your debt. So my complaint is not about austerity in the abstract. It's when you have countries simultaneously, who in particular in Europe are each other's trading partners, they share the same currency, all trying to save at the one time. The result is a collective catastrophe. And if the United States, as the world's largest economy, joins in this at the same time, the only thing that can happen is that we end up in another long recession. Does this mean you keep spending forever? No, stop. But stop cutting too, and let the economy recover.
All right, well, we have to take a break, and we're going to talk much more about what your books has to say about America and Rhode Island. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and my guest this week is Mark Blyth. He's a professor of international political economy. Did I get the order right? International political economy at Brown University, and author of the new book, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, just out from Oxford University Press, and getting good reviews. And we're talking about his argument in the book. It's a good read. Before the book came out, though, you actually made a web video.
Yeah.
This was back in 2010. We showed a little of it in the opening there. And that video, as you can see it up here, it went viral. It's not exactly a Justin Bieber music video, but it is very engaging. How did this come about? How did you end up making a video about austerity?
Well, what happened was, let me backtrack. why even bother with this topic? And the answer is this. I'm a welfare kid. I say this in the introduction, right? I grew up on the British welfare state. My mother died when I was very young, and I was raised with a grandmother and a state retirement pension. So I became an Ivy League professor from very humble origins. And if you start cutting government spending, it's people like me who don't get a chance. It's not the kids at Brown. They're still going to be okay. So it's that drove me to do this. So when the group of 20 industrialized nations have their annual meeting, and in 2010 they said, oh, we've stimulated too much, now we have to start cutting, I thought this is a really silly idea, a dangerous idea, where the subtitle comes from. And someone at Watson said to me, the Watson Institute, where I'm a faculty fellow, would you like to make a video about something? And I thought, oh yes. This turn to austerity politics is kind of stupid. So I wanted to actually say that. So I then had to sit down and write a 5-minute version of
was
why
that hard to do, to boil your ideas down?
Working with the producer that they had on it was great. I mean, he did it on a shoestring budget for nothing. I mean, as a commercial guy, he was doing this as a freebie, as a favour to friends more than anything else. But putting it together, being able to use the animation, and actually forcing an academic to use plain language and say, look, what's the core issues here? Let's talk about it, let's get it out. It was great to write it down, and it really helped me then write the book. Because if you can get it down to 5 minutes, and then you say, okay, now give me the full version, you've got a template you can work with. So it was a really great learning experience for me. The fact that it went viral, yeah, I mean, you know, thousands of users. There's a Portuguese translation. Go figure,
really?
like kicking around on YouTube. So yeah, a lot of people have seen it. So
and of course, you know, it's a good point. This is not. People might be a little worried. Austerity. It sounds like it's going to be 800 pages, but this is actually a quick and pretty lively read for the topic being so heavy as it is. So tell me about the response you get to the video. I saw it. I found it all over the place when I was working on my research for the show.
Well, you get you know, a lot of people will tag it and say it's good and stick it on Facebook and send it around and this sort of stuff. And then you get some hate mail, frankly, you know, you're just another dangerous fool who wants to cause hyperinflation. It's like, no, I don't. I really don't. But I don't think this is the right thing to. I'll go on record. Yeah. I do not favour hype. Well, then again, I'm just about to take on a big mortgage, so maybe a little inflation might be a good thing. Right. But, you know, but in all seriousness, you know, you get a lot of feedback. And you get it from all around the world. And it's very interesting to see, you know, people in countries that are undergoing austerity programs, you know, they obviously receive this very different from people who think their country should be undergoing an austerity program. So interesting to see the difference.
I can imagine some viewers saying, oh, Ted brought on this liberal academic
yes,
propagandist.
He's,
you know, he's a communist, Step Brown there at in the Ivy League. But you said in an interview you have a great deal of sympathy for the Tea Party movement. Yeah. Why do you say that? Because
these guys understood something right from the start. When the banks were bailed out, they were ultimately going to pay. That money has to come from somewhere, and it's going to come out of middle class and working class people's taxes. So when you bail the financial sector, when you take all the debt onto the balance sheet of the central bank and you give them all this free cash, the giant asset swap that's been done, ultimately this is going to show up in more government debt. That government debt does have to be paid back, hence why we're talking about austerity. But this is where I break with the Tea Party, because they go, right, so let's cut Social Security. And my argument is, well, why should 67-year-old retirees have to pay for the mistakes of Wall Street bankers? Now, if that puts me more in the Tea Party camp than in another camp, sign me up. Because basically what happened was unfair. What happened was anti-capitalist. They should have went bust. We bought the argument that they were too big to fail. Were they? When you look at the loss of jobs, the loss of income, the loss of everything that we've had in the crisis, the estimates now go as high as $13 trillion. That's what that cost. This is way beyond the Obama stimulus, way beyond what we think of the normal bailout. Well, if that's the case, that makes me a Tea Partier, because I think that they're right. We shouldn't have bailed them. Sign me up.
One thing is interesting. You're seeing the politics of this change a little lately. Republican U.S. Senator David Vitter is joining with the very liberal Ohio Democrat Sherrod Brown, and they had a resolution that passed saying we don't want too big to fail anymore. I mean, do you think there could be a time where you see some bipartisan in the American way of thinking, people uniting around that idea, you're saying?
Well, there has to be, because the tragedy of the situation is the American fiscal system is broken in the following sense, and this is where I will now sound like someone who's not in the Tea Party. Here's the dirty little secret. You get what you pay for. And we don't pay enough. Now, I know I can hear people throwing things at the screen, right? But let me give you some numbers on this. In the sort of the distribution of advanced industrial economies, right, the average tax take and spend by the central government is about 36%. The US federal state spends 25%, taxes at 17%. That gap is your deficit. Multiply that over years, you end up with a debt without even bailing out a financial institution. Add to that 2 wars of choice, add to that 2 sets of tax cuts that never paid for themselves, and you have got a heck of a lot of debt. Now, you're going to have to deal with that debt at some point. Would you rather deal with that debt when your economy is growing, or would you rather actually enforce a slump on yourself and make it worse? And that seems to be the argument that's being made. I think that is a rather strange and dangerous argument, and that's why the book is there.
We're only about 30 seconds before the next break, but look over at Europe. 60% youth unemployment in Spain, mess still in Greece, Cyprus now. What do you think is going to happen there?
All I can hope is that it gets better, and the only way it can get better is if they essentially do what we've done in the United States, which is the thing I would also criticize for not letting the banks fail. At the end of the day, the European banking system is twice as big and 3 times as levered as the American system, and it's filled with dead assets. And the whole crisis in Europe, although it's called a sovereign debt crisis, is really an extension of the same banking crisis that we had. Problem, they can't do a Ben Bernanke. They can't take out the assets, fill it with capital, clean up the system, and restart the machine. So they just add liquidity, squeeze, and pray. That's what they've been doing. I think that's a time-limited trick. You're going to see eventually the problem with running a very hard money regime in this sense, cuts, cuts, cuts. People don't vote for cuts more than twice.
And you're seeing that now in the election
results. You're seeing that now, and that's what we
there.
saw in the 1930s. Let's not forget, the reactionaries that won were voted in many cases.
That's right, in Hitler's case, among others.
Absolutely.
All right, we have to take another break. When we come back, more on austerity and what it means for Rhode Island. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. My guest is Brown University professor Mark Blyth, author of the new book, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. It's on sale now, and he's joined us to talk about it. You mentioned in the last segment, Mark, about your own background. You were born in Scotland in the 1960s. You lived through the Margaret Thatcher prime ministership, which was very tough on the more downtrodden parts of Britain. How does this impact, when you look at yourself and your own history, and now you look at the policies being implemented? How did that affect your decision to write this?
I was very strongly motivated by it. I mean, the thing about the United States that I adore, I'm a citizen, I've been here for 23 years. I've lived longer in the United States than I have in Scotland now. And the thing that I love about the United States, amongst many things, is that, when you're unemployed in the United States, you think it's your fault. You're unemployed in Scotland, you think it's the government's fault and should get you a job. And in that way, kind of the ideas that people bring to the table about, the role of the government, the role of the state, etc. American ideas create a much more dynamic economy in this way. But it's also a harsher place in many ways. And what used to save us was social mobility. So the fact that the guy could start in the mailroom and become the CEO, that doesn't happen anymore. You look at the cost of college tuition, you look at the spread of the income distribution between the haves and the have-nots and how it's become very, very wide over the past 30 years. And the opportunities that were there because of things like welfare state institutions, free schooling, etc., school meal support, things that made it possible for me to learn and educate and get myself out of the way, they're the things that are on a chopping block. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're doing something very dangerous in a capitalist society. Everyone should have a shot. Everyone should have a chance to better themselves as they see. This is what Adam Smith said hundreds of years ago, that betterment of your condition is the thing that drives us forward. And if you basically stack the deck, particularly on the bottom end, that doesn't end well. And it also means that the next me doesn't get to happen. And that is the motivation in many ways behind doing this whole thing.
And you mentioned you've been in the States for quite a while. You came to Brown from Johns Hopkins in 2009. How do you like Brown? How do you like it here?
I think it's great. I mean, I lived in Baltimore for 11 years. So you come to Providence. As I used to joke to my wife, it's like, how are you enjoying Paris?
Wow.
It's a bit of a contrast. Sorry, Baltimore, I'm just going to say that. But
we've all seen The Wire.
We've all seen The Wire, exactly, which I like to tell people is actually a documentary. But you come here at first. My wife's work took her to Boston, so we actually live up there. So I do the commute, which is less wonderful. But it's a great part of the world, and I enjoy it. I like living here. It's good.
Speaking of Rhode Island, we had Central Falls go bankrupt.
Yep.
We had the Central Coventry Fire District being dissolved after they can't come to terms on the taxes there. What do you make of what's happening here in Rhode Island? Does it reflect in any way the ideas you're talking about in a bigger scale in the book Austerity?
It does, and of course it's complicated on the state level because state debt is different from federal debt, and you have balanced budget requirements and all this sort of stuff. So it creates a much tighter fiscal environment. Speaker Fox organized the kind of a one-day seminar for incoming legislators, of which I was happy to be part of. And I went back and looked at the figures, and I looked at how much the budget consolidation had happened in Rhode Island since 2008, 2009. You guys could teach the feds how to close the books, but there's a lot of casualties in doing this. Now, here's the difference. It's like the thesis in austerity. Imagine every state in the union did this at once. It'd be a catastrophe. Thankfully, not every state was impacted. And you also had federal help. And when you have federal extension of unemployment benefits, when you have stimulus money, when you have other things coming in, which can in a sense act as substitutes for the revenue that you're losing, then you're able to transit out of this quicker and lessen the pain overall. So Rhode Island did a fabulous fiscal consolidation if you look at it in terms of where you were and where you are now. But it was a very, very painful one. But it would have been much more painful had everyone tried to do it at the same time across the country.
Including
Let's
the
cut
federal
everything
government.
out, including the federal government. That would have been catastrophic. You wouldn't have actually seen the budgets closing. You would have seen them widening despite the cuts. That's what's happening in Europe.
You believe passionately that ideas matter. You said that in a number of interviews as you've been doing this book, and it's in your work. I'm curious, what books and thinkers shaped you? What led you to where you are today? Who really impacted you?
Who really impacted me? There's no real one source. I mean, someone who's a friend of mine, and I've written a piece with him, is a guy called Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan.
Yeah.
And I think he's a tremendously...
He comes off as fierce. I didn't know he had friends.
And I'm one of them. I think I am. Once he reads this book, I'm not so sure. But, he's a contemporary influence. Adam Smith. David Hume, the Scottish philosophers, the people who set up capitalism. We thought it was a good idea. And you have to remember, back in the day, this 1700s, capitalism was yet to become something. The whole system of the world that we take for granted now, people had to argue for that. They had to struggle for that. They had to fight for that. The original capitalists were as revolutionary as the 100 years later the communists were revolutionaries. They were just revolutionaries in a different way. We've mentioned John Maynard Keynes. I would be foolish to deny that he has been an influence. But it comes from many, many different sources.
Yeah. You're working on another book. You've been for a while. You called it once The Ever-Evolving Behemoth, and you called it The End of a Liberal World. And I think you're using the British version of liberal there, right? Like freedom.
It's actually a bit of both. Yeah. Liberal's the wrong word, and that's part of the problem. When you don't have a good title, then you don't know what to write. I mean, so I work by, give me a title, then I know what I'm doing. And what this book is really about is about the growth of the financial sector. As you think about it this way, by 2007, 40% of the profits in the United States were being generated by the financial sector. The financial sector is a pass-through. It's meant to connect somebody who's got money they're not using with somebody who wants the money to do something more productive. And then they pay them a fee and rate of interest, and they sit in the middle and take a fee. How can that be 40% of the profits? There's something not quite right with this. Yeah. So massive amounts of leverage, systemic risk, basically a free option of the kind of insurance policy of the taxpayer, right? All this sort of stuff. So what I'm interested in doing is, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, had a phrase, creative destruction. My thesis is the following. What happens when your rate of destructive creation in finance is greater than your rate of creative destruction in the real economy? That's what that book's trying to flesh out.
Well, I'll have you back when it's done. Thank you, Mark, for joining me this week. If you missed any of the show, you can catch it all online at our website, WPRI.com. See you next week and every week here on Executive Suite.